We now move to our second session, Women Governing AI, Standards, Governance and Trust. This discussion will highlight the importance of inclusive governance frameworks. This session will highlight the importance of inclusive governance frameworks to build a trustworthy and accountable AI systems. To guide this important session, please join in welcoming Ms. Salma Karim, Head of Human Capital and Innovation Department at ADD. It's an honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, and dear colleagues, it is an honor to open our second panel, Women Governing AI, Standards, Governance, and Trust. Synchronization. We are at a crossroads where AI is shifting from a tech experiment to the foundational infrastructure of modern society. But for this infrastructure to hold, it requires trust. And trust is not an accident. It is built through governance. AI is more than a leap in code. It is a transformation of power, of standards, and societal alignment. Governance is the bridge between technological potential and human safety. Today, we aren't just discussing participation, we are discussing leadership. We place women at the center of this dialogue, not as tokens of diversity, but as architects defining the norms that underpin trustworthy AI. From intellectual property law to algorithmic safety, our speakers today are shaping the frameworks that will define the digital future of the world. We are here to see how women-led governance is turning the ideal of exclusive AI into global reality. The real question for today is, how do women leaders shape AI governance systems that are globally aligned, locally relevant, and capable of building trust at scale, particularly across the global south? We are joined today by an outstanding panel of experts. First, under your applause, of course, Dr. Maha Gmira, CTO at Solution AI, bringing deep expertise at the intersection of AI strategy, African governance frameworks, and technical execution. Second, Dr. Ulrike, Director at World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, leading work on intellectual property and frontier technologies, please, and how intellectual property shapes trust and innovation globally. Ms. Bridget Shoo, please join us under your applause, of course. Counsellor at the World Trade Organization, WTO, working on AI, trade, and digital cooperation with a strong focus on equity and global inclusion. Mr. Sasha Cadariu, Director of AI Strategy, please join us under the applause. Director of AI Strategy and Ethics at the Integrity Group, specializing in AI safety, governance, architecture, and adversarial testing. Last but not least, Ms. Clara, Executive Director of Kompass Education, please join us. Of Kompass Education, focusing on AI, governance in education, and child-centered system. Thank you all for being here, and let's start. So let's begin with the foundation of governance. AI standards are often presented as universal, but in reality, they are shaped by who defines them, whose perspectives are included, and whose realities are reflected. Maha, I'm starting with you. So how do we adapt global AI ethical standards to ensure they aren't just universal in name, but reflect the local social norms and realities of Morocco and the border African countries?
Thank you, Salma. I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks again for the invitation and very nice organization and all the work made by the team. So very happy today to be here. Actually, it's a very opportune question since the last panel ends with inclusivity. And I think the regional integration of AI is one of the key elements that we must think when it's about gathering together to get an African or regional AI. So that's a very nice question, but there is a straightforward answer, which is, of course, a lot of potential on using AI in the African continent, in Morocco, and more largely in the African continent, starting by, of course, our own priorities like agriculture, with the yield selection using algorithms, but also medicine, health care in general, and of course, education. That's the very general answer, and it's a reality. But at the same time, my biggest, because I have been working for the African Union, and I've noticed that we might commit a very big mistake. It's not about if Africa have to start with AI, but when and how. Because there we as Africans have cautionary lessons with, for example, Ghana. Ghana as a country have started to invest massively to get industrialized during the 15 and 16 in mainly hydroelectric energy. But the problem is that it faltered completely because of the weak linkage with the market, and also this hydroelectric investments depended massively on the international exports. So, I think we don't have to hurry up. We have to get our priorities. And of course, when we talk about Africa, we have some shocking numbers. Internet penetration, Salma, today in Africa, the rate stands 38, when it's the global average is 68th. We have also the recent report of the World Economic Forum says that the African continent have less than 1% of the global data center capacity, and even less than 1% when it comes to the GPU's capacity, which powers, of course, AI. And of course, when we are talking about research, development, scientific research, Africa counts less than 1% of the global AI research. So you see, I think we don't have to put premature, but I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think we need to be realistic to put the right steps at the right time. And I think we have more urgent things like the digitization, the infrastructure, getting the proper sectors, as of course, which defines our own reality in our continent, and then set, of course, I'm sorry, I'm a bit raw, but there is another point I wanted to add, Salma, if you allow me. I mentioned the example of Ghana, but there is also another example, which is not, of course, in Africa, which is Brazil. And Brazil's PIX is a very famous instantaneous payment, which was a very, very high penetrated, like 160 million users in very short time. So I think we can wisely play between how to turn Africa as a late turnover turn it to an advantage to the continent. yeah, I think...
Thank you very much, Maha.
Okay.
Yes, this is a great introduction, and this is the reality of the Global South. Now let's move about more and more international and global realities, and I will address the question to Bridget. So regarding the World Trade Organization research that suggests that AI could boost global trade up by 37% by 2040. So however, low-income economies risk seeing only a fraction of that. So what governance must-haves are required to ensure AI narrows the digital divide between economies, global economies, instead of doubling it? Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question, and really excited to be here. The question of inclusive growth and inclusive trade is something that we are very concerned with, and we sort of think about in the World Trade Organization. So this, and that's the reason why we dedicated last year's World Trade Report to this very topic. So our research shows that by 2040, when we modeled different scenarios, AI can actually increase global GDP by somewhere about 13% and global trade by up to 37%. And this is because it would lead to trade cost savings, the growth of AI services sector, as well as productivity gains. When we also pulsed businesses on how they are using AI, I think we also see great promise in terms of bringing more SMEs into the global trading system, as well as we see more smaller companies using AI to do more research about global market opportunities. But all of this rests on certain conditions, and that is really how well we are able to close the digital infrastructure as well as policy gap. In a scenario where there is sort of no narrowing of this gap. For low-income economies, global GDP would sort of increase by 8%. But if you narrow that gap, their gains actually double. And so I think that really sets the stage for the importance of really narrowing this. I think my colleagues sort of talked about the gaps that we are seeing in terms of digital infrastructure. I sort of wanted to maybe expand a little bit on what we're seeing in terms of on the ground for the policy rollout. Right now, I think it is very uneven. For low-income economies, we see that for AI policies, only about 8% of this group of economies have actually introduced some form of policy, whereas for high-income economies, that number is about 68%. We did an AI trade policy openness index to also see the extent to which these policies are also open and enabling these sort of trade-related activities. And we found that on the surface, low-income economies appear open, but actually that is more due to the fact that they don't have any regulations. And so I think the point is regulations, when designed well, can create greater predictability as well as enable greater trust. Now then, what is these policies that economies need to think about? And I think it really depends on the economy itself. We generally sort of suggest that a mapping exercise can be helpful to understand what the current gaps are and where each economy is also doing very well in. I think earlier in the panel and sort of earlier this morning, we hear a lot about what Morocco has done in terms of education and strength, and perhaps maybe there needs to be focus on somewhere else instead. And I think rather than also, apart from just thinking about specific policies, I think it's also important to think about the coherence and the coordination between all the policies, trade, competition, labor, even for IP. This is not in and of itself going to be enough, and there needs to be that coordination to really sort of ensure that the outcome is what is intended.
Thank you, Bridget. We'll probably tackle the regulation and governance frameworks, but when we talk about economy, prosperous economy, it is mainly driven by strong innovation ecosystems. And my question goes to Ulrike. So how does a robust intellectual property framework serves as the primary foundation for trust between AI innovators, and the public?
Thank you so much for that question. Also, thank you so much for having me, because take you into a niche corner of intellectual property. Maybe not something that many of you are familiar with, but something that has suddenly become center stage in the AI governance world. And maybe, so what I mean by intellectual property, for those that are not familiar with it, it is the patents that protect innovations, it's the copyright that protect works that AI models are being trained with, it's the brands that the companies and SMEs build to hit the global market and global trade. Taking a step back, I don't think trust in itself is something that is given or something that comes by itself. I think trust is built, if I take the example of intellectual property, and has always been built on predictability and accountability. So I think any type of policy, and that's the same for IP as everywhere, will have to build accountability and have to account predictability in order to build that trust. Now, I give you an example from my niche corner of the world of intellectual property. Some of you will probably have seen that a couple of years ago, there was an artwork that won a global art competition. And everyone was taken by surprise once the award was given. It was revealed that this piece of art was actually generated by an AI model. Actually knowing who owns something in itself gives predictability, and knowing who owns something means you know who's responsible for it, and that gives you accountability. So one of the things that IP policy is struggling with is the uncertainty that we have around these days. If something is generated purely by AI, if creators like everyone around the world, the global south, are starting to use AI tools, knowing who owns it, in terms of my world of IPs, that who owns the copyright in it and who's accountable for it. To give you another example, because IP isn't just copyright, we talk about innovations, in the AI space. I think a term that everyone here is familiar with is the black box of not knowing how AI models actually work. And one of the contributions of IP policy to all of this is for an innovation to be protected by a patent, by a monopoly. There is a bargain that is struck in the IP system, and that is you have to disclose the innovation in such a way that you can repeat it in order to get a patent for it. So the IP policy and IP systems around the world, even before AI, had an inbuilt thing that you need to share knowledge, you need to provide disclosure in order to be rewarded with an incentive to innovate. Another example of how IP policy continues to build trust. At the end of the day, having those rights, having copyrights, having patents protecting innovation also gives a right that allows you to license, a right that allows small companies, women companies to raise finance with it, to franchise it. So I think having a right, having the ownership, having the accountability and predictability will also serve to get the technology to many places around the world. And maybe in the last 30 seconds, I leave you with an example, because that can sound terribly theoretical. But I am sure most of us have heard of the big fights that are going on between, say, OpenAI on one hand and the New York Times at the other hand. Many creators around the world in the global south complaining that their works have been scraped off the internet. They've been used to train these AI models. No compensation, no consent was given. One of the things that IP policy is trying to do is to provide the trust, provide copyright that it will allow for transparency, that will allow of knowing which works were used, and that will allow the accountability of compensation to flow. But I'll end where I started, is trust is not a given. Trust needs to be built, but you don't inbuild trust in a policy. What you inbuild in a policy is predictability, accountability, the things that people will then start trusting in.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. As you are witnessing, we are starting to gather all the puzzle pieces of AI governance. Now, I might move to Sasha, and regarding your experience, you advocate for moving beyond perspective principles. What does a truly rigorous governance architecture look like in practice for high-impact AI deployment?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and thank you, Morocco AI, for putting this wonderful event together. As I see it, high-impact deployments are kind of defined by risk, right? And so in order to be able to govern them effectively, we need to understand how to translate a variety of core concepts from the risk space into practices that we can actually operationalize within the governance frameworks that we develop around these deployments, right? So basically what I'm going to do here is run through a few concepts and then kind of show focus on 3 core mechanisms that we can actually implement within our governance architectures to ensure that they have a base level of rigor that's actually capable of accounting for these high impact deployments. So kind of to get into these concepts, the first one that we have is risk magnitude. That's essentially a product of risk severity and likelihood. We also need to look at impact scale, so the number of people, systems, or institutions that are actually affected by a risk once it materializes. And this is one that's I've found is actually overlooked quite frequently in most risk management frameworks, but intractability or reversibility, which is essentially a measure of how difficult it is to reverse the impact of a risk once it's materialized, right? So we have to be able to look ahead and anticipate what might happen and plan for it. Now, on top of those, we also need to understand residual risk, which is essentially the risk. I don't like to use the word leftover or that remains, because I think it implies that once you've implemented all controls, all you're dealing with is what's left over. In reality, the implementation of controls can actually create new risks, and you need to be aware of those as you move forward. Now, we also have cascading or compounding risk trajectories, which tend to be most prevalent within systems that are highly interconnected. Agentic infrastructures would be a great example of this, right? So if you have one failure at some layer of that agentic infrastructure, there's a very strong possibility that it's actually going to cascade and compound across subsequent layers. And last but not least, this is also one that I think is overlooked quite often, is risk progression. So we actually have timelines for how a risk unfolds, whether it's immediate or incremental or somewhere in between. So for me, the core question is, how do we take all these concepts and actually operationalize them, right? What mechanisms do we need to implement to make this work? Well, I kind of have three that I like to think of. We have pre-deployment sandboxes. These are essentially controlled and secure testing environments where we subject systems to adversarial testing, capability and limitation assessment, boundary evaluation, edge case and ambiguity handling, uncertainty management, and so on. Now, the findings from these should directly inform what I will refer to as a continuous monitoring infrastructure. And the word infrastructure here is intentional. I'm sorry, I ran out of time. I'll wrap up here quickly. The word infrastructure is intentional for a few reasons. It's not as simple as we need a human in the loop, we need an accountability board, and we need oversight procedures. We need a full tech stack, just as we need the people, just as we need the roles and responsibilities, just as we need the tools to understand what is actually happening once a system has been deployed, right? Is it behaving in line with its intended purpose? Is it being used in line with its intended use, and so on? And last but not least, we have recall and remediation protocols, which I think are extremely important and, again, directly informed by what you learn through the continuous monitoring infrastructure, through feedback and reporting, through escalation, through the various triggers or events that you identify that, that then lead you to actually say, well, maybe this system should be temporarily suspended or perhaps even permanently removed from the market.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Donc, regarding moving from governance and architecture, I might capitalize on your experience, Clara, in the educational sector regarding accountability. So why must institutional accountability stay with executive leadership rather than being outsourced to vendors in your position?
Yeah, fantastic question, and thank you so much, and thank you to everyone here. So we have heard a lot about AI since 2023, and the story we have heard has been big tech's story about how the world will be, what this technology can do, and how important it is to incorporate it into our workflow, or else we either will lose our work or will be replaced by someone who knows how to use artificial intelligence. And it has created a sense of urgency indeed, but it has also created confusion. And I think one place we see that more than anything is within education. Because the story about AI was that this was about a tools moment. And what we're really seeing is a story about an infrastructure shift. And school leaders and institutional leadership who have entered this thinking that it is a tools moment has missed opportunities to step into a more future-centric leadership, but also to learn how to manage these cultural and behavioral changes that happens with AI. And in that sense of urgency, employees have also been experimenting and testing AI, because that's what we've heard in the news that we're supposed to do, or else. And I'm reminded of a story that came out in a media outlet some months ago about a German professor who was very frustrated because he had spent 2 years on a privately held ChatGPT subscription, and he had been using it for all of his research storage. He had been using it to review research proposals, grant proposals, student papers, to give feedback to some of his university students. And then he went in to change the settings on his ChatGPT to increase the data protection. And as a result, all of his data was deleted. So he was extremely frustrated enough that he was compelled to write this article about how that is not okay and we should be more careful. And I think all of us in AI governance are chuckling at this, because that's not really the issue with the story. The issue is that an employee took it upon himself to open a private subscription and put in student data and use that for high-stakes decisions that can significantly impact their future pathways without authorization for his organization, without managerial oversight, without risk management processes being put in place, and more importantly, without informed consent from the students whose data, although it is deleted, has been used to train AI models. And I think that's a good example of why executive leaderships are compelled to step up.
Thank you very much, Clara. And this is crystal clear about the role of leadership and accountability, especially using generative AI tools. So let's now move from principles to implementation, because governance is not only written in policies, it is embedded in systems, standards, and institutional practices. And now that we have Maha Gmira with us, and she is in a female leadership role in AI specifically. So as a CTO, we need your testimonial. So how do you bridge the gap between abstract ethical principles and actual technical protocols, and check and balance system during the development phase of your projects?
Actually, we don't. I have no magical recipe, unfortunately, because I have seen a lot of expectations from the audience. So please lower your expectations. But allow me to say that, of course, we're trying very hard. I'm very sensitive, as well as the team, with me to these questions, but there is no, it wasn't actually, it was half a joke, because actually that's true. There is no magical recipe, but there is a continuous effort that organizations, as well as institutions and companies, have to do. And of course, at a larger stage, governance and regions. So concretely, what we do is, since it's an event all around women leadership in AI, the first thing is, of course, a diversified team. That's the secret. I learned it when I was in US, and I still apply it here and everywhere. When we have a diversified team that brings different perspective, that allows to avoid blind spots, that's also gives different social and cultural backgrounds. So that's very important. That's the key. The first element, that's one of the elements. Then second, of course, we work with the customers. And of course, we don't own their data. So what we noticed through different regions, from GCCs to Europe, as well as Africa, what we noticed is the data is not representative of so we have to work on the data. We have to sensitize them on the importance of having a diverse data set that, as I said, for the team, stands also for the data set. So that allows not only the gender bias, but many biases. They're not conscious about this element, that the data is so much important, even before the solution that we're selling to them. You have to prepare your data. That's the second point. Also, what my recommendation is, of course, to comply with the regional standards as well as regulations, but also to have, you know what I have noticed also, Salma, in some companies we worked with, is that they're very happy to have AI. So this selling AI products today is no longer an issue anywhere, of course. However, they're not prepared, really prepared, deeply prepared. So no data governance, no frameworks, no policies. So even though they're very looking forward to buy the solution or to work with us, we just start by telling them, look, let's start by the sandbox. Let's start by a pilot program. Let's start by a small project within the team to test the infrastructure, to test also the ability of the team to get into this solution, etc. So a lot of things, but there is, of course, after all, what we have to do is not to just start with AI and forget everything. It's a continuous monitoring that we have to do. I usually give this example to the people I'm talking to, is that suppose that you get a new car. So of course, a very fancy car that just gets out from the car dealer, and it complies with all the standards and all the regulations of your country. And however, if you use it for 10, 15 years without any control, what does that give at the end? So that's exactly what we are doing with AI solutions. I'm gonna overtime a bit, if you don't mind, Salma. I have noticed that the biggest problem in governance, data governance in general, this ethical issues in AI systems, is that people are still using AI systems thinking that they are a very traditional software solutions, which they are not. I can give examples. The first one is the software systems are deterministic. The AI systems are probabilistic. You put input, you get an output from the traditional AI softwares and software systems. In AI systems, you get different output. This is what we call the randomness component of the AI systems. The data is learned by the humans in a traditional software, rather than by the data, and it might change. And this data is also a very tricky point, because you have the steady data that we can control, that we are good at governing at some point, depending on where you are in the world. But globally, what we don't master that much and that well, of course, is the motion data, the data that we're creating, generating, and in motion, of course. So that's, I'm sorry, my time is up.
Thank you, Maha. So we understood that it takes a lot of commitment, vision, and leadership, and on an everyday basis. Thank you for your testimonial. We've been talking a little bit around regulation, so I'd like to ask Ulrike a question regarding that. So with the countries racing to regulate, how do we prevent regulatory fragmentation from becoming a barrier for women entrepreneurs trying to scale AI solutions internationally?
Oh, if I had the answer to that, I would bottle it. But I mean, I'll start at a point again. I mean, fragmentation in itself is serious. And the reason it is serious, it is because it has a real economic impact. I give you an example. You can tell I'm someone who lives in examples. But when you think about what's happening, going back to the example about AI companies training on massive amounts of data scraped off the internet that is copyright protected, and there's a real question whether that is legal or not legal. If you are one of the big tech bros out there, you take that as a legal risk. You take that as a cost of business that you factor in. You take that as a payment in your balance sheet that you might have to pay out at the end of the day, but you take it as a payment that you need to get that competitive advantage first to post. If you are a small startup company, if you're a women-led business, if you're a small business in the global south, you don't have the market power and the paying power in order to mitigate against that risk. So what you do when there's fragmentation, when there's legal uncertainty, I think you have two choices. You either train on what is perceived to be legal data, which increases your cost base, or you use data that is out of date that you also now know is legally compliant, but it implicates the performance of your model. Both of them mean that you are less competitive, and both of them mean fragmentation. To give you an example, why fragmentation is actually something that's really important to talk about, because no doubt about it, it has real impact on the bottom line and on the economic effect. Now, in an IP space, what do we at WIPO do about it? I think we're not going to be able to avoid fragmentation. When you think about the positions being taken between the US and China and Europe in the middle, they are so far apart. Also because none of us know the answers. Countries are rightfully experimenting with different systems that might be more suitable for the ecosystems. So I think the answer to it, or one of the answers, there's not a single answer, otherwise I would bottle it, lies in a word called interoperability. If countries will decide to have different regulations as they will, we need to find ways for companies, for for SMEs, to move smoothly between those systems. Again, what do I mean by this? I come from an IP space. When you think about it from a copyright space, if you are in a country where the country decides, yes, copyright owners should have a payment if AI companies train on their pictures, on their material from the internet, that is all good and well. How do you make sure that that AI company that pays $1 million or $1 billion or something more, how do you split land between 1 million copyright owners and make sure it actually gets to the people of the works that were scraped off the internet? The answer to that lies in technical things like metadata, like identifiers and technical solutions. So at WIPO, we strongly believe that one of the ways to address fragmentation is to proceed with policy conversations in parallel with conversations about technical solutions and interoperability. Two more, I think things like the things we're doing here right now, dialogue can't be underestimated. Because in order to address fragmentation, you have to know what other people around the world are doing. So while it's a world where multilateralism isn't the most popular word anymore, actually having that and having those exchanges are absolutely key. And the final thing in the last 3 seconds that I have is actually working with people on the ground, grassroots projects, trying to help the people that have the SMEs, trying to help the people that are opening their business in the space and navigate the fragmentation is a third bit that we can do.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. I do retain interoperability, working together, discussion and dialogue, which leads to international cooperation. So I will be probably asking this question to Bridget. So how can international cooperation on digital public goods like multilingual LLMs help countries maintain digital sovereignty while fostering inclusivity?
I think it's a start on digital sovereignty, and I think by extension AI sovereignty. It is not a very well-defined concept. It means something very different depending on who you ask. It marries a lot of different concepts around security, around economic competitiveness, cultural representation, amongst others. And part of this kind of deals with the fact that AI is inherently a cross-border technology. It relies very much on the flows of data, of talent, of ideas across many different jurisdictions, and that in and of itself creates a lot of risk around privacy, around security, etc. And so I think when different jurisdictions are thinking about what their response is, they need to think about sort of the why. Why are they pursuing this? The what and the where in the AI tech stack do they want to make an impact in, and where is it also feasible? As well as the how. And the how bit, I think, is sort of the real challenging part. I think for most economies, full ownership of the tech stack is going to be very costly, perhaps even maybe not even feasible, just by virtue, again, of AI being very much a cross-border technology. And I think regulation could be another approach, and I think as what Ulrike mentioned, there is the risk of regulatory fragmentation that's happening. I think to add on to what the examples that you have raised, in our survey that we did with businesses, 34% of them highlighted that adapting to different data privacy regulations is one of the biggest challenge that they are facing in trade. In adopting AI in trade. And 64% said that they estimate that having to adapt to this brings about at least a 5% cost to their businesses. And so what is potentially another model? I think what we are seeing from certain countries or certain economies is, I think, the idea of shared capacity or shared capability. I think Switzerland, they released their own open source LLM model that was trained on 1,000 languages, which they tried to be gender neutral as well. It's called Apertus. They have released it and imbued in it what they felt were very much Swiss values. On the other side of the world, in Singapore, they have also developed their own open source models trained on Southeast Asian languages, which they hope would enable the representation of the region, in the AI world. Part of this was also to address some of the security vulnerabilities that could come from jailbreaking using non-English languages as well. And so I think, across these two examples, I kind of want to offer up perhaps a metaphor that maybe we could think about and sort of wonder whether or not we could think about AI systems as almost like Lego, where you sort of, in building these AI models or systems that these two examples have done, and they have released it out and shared it, they are building their own capacity and understanding of the technology, but sort of enabling others to use it. And so, the same way that I hope you guys have played Lego when you are growing up, as I have done, where you build something and you kind of pass it on, or someone can kind of join in to build alongside you. The building blocks are very much the same, and that kind of allows you, and that speaks to, I think, the interoperability principle that Ulrike was also talking about. And I think that is what, us as, in the international organizations are really trying to facilitate that dialogue, that transparency to really enable interoperability to actually be put into practice.
Thank you very much, Bridget. So I capitalize on what you said, what Ulrike said, and what Maha regarding the building blocks, the cooperation, the multidisciplinary teams, and I capitalize also on Sasha's background on adversarial testing, and I would like to dig a little bit deeper on that. So in your opinion, what specific blind spots are often overlooked by teams that lack gender and cognitive diversity?
Yeah, so I love this question because I'm someone with a very non-traditional background when it comes to adversarial testing and evaluation. I studied philosophy, psychology. Is it working? Philosophy, psychology, and applied ethics. And somehow I got good at this stuff. And I think, just to take a step back here, I think one of the issues, or the key issue here, is actually more general than it is specific, in the sense that a traditional red team, which is essentially a specialized team tasked with finding vulnerabilities within an advanced system, typically is composed of specialists with technical expertise, right? So they're coming from backgrounds like cryptography, cybersecurity, hacking, penetration testing. And that experience is, of course, invaluable. But it assumes that the available attack surface is technical. And in doing so, overlooks a very significant portion of what is the true available attack surface, particularly with advanced conversational AI models like Claude or GPT or Gemini and so forth, which is, in fact, operational. So I think it really helps to think about this in terms of a question, right? So if you're looking at the traditional red team focus, their perspective centers on AI as a software to be broken or corrupted. the question that I tend to ask when I run adversarial tests on these systems, or the perspective that I tend to assume, is AI is an entity that can be persuaded. And it's a subtle distinction, but it's one that's worthwhile. Because when you start to interact with these systems in a way that takes their behavior at face value, you start to see that they display certain tendencies that align with assumptions that we can actually predictably model. One of those assumptions is rational actor behavior. So, for example, you can create constrained scenarios that leverage evolutionarily motivated selection environments coupled with game theoretic incentives that reliably elicit bad outcomes without the AI ever recognizing that it's actually facilitating a bad outcome. And that's something, like when I run these kinds of tests, I tend to use what's called a multi-shot or a multi-turn sequence that's pre-designed and orchestrated across a variety of models simultaneously. And what that means is that I'm not just issuing 1 or 2 or 3 prompts. I'm actually designing a strategy that operates over an extended context to then create various kinds of pressures and conditions that inadvertently put the system in a position where it's executing dangerous behaviors. And the sad reality here is that if we don't expand the scope of expertise within red teams to include, people like philosophers, economists, linguists, and especially creatives, then what we're basically assuming is, okay, these systems have already reached the scale of billions in terms of users, particularly systems like GPT, and we're operating on the assumption that a very small fraction of those users who might have malicious intent will simply be unable to bypass the guardrails that are on those systems. And that's not the case. If I can do it, sure, I've managed to weaponize logic. I've managed to create very specific kinds of scenarios that capitalize on behavioral tendencies that I've observed in all of the testing that I've done. But the fact of the matter is, you just need to understand how the system operates to be able to exploit it. And you can exploit it using natural language. And by the way, I've done many tests where I've actually obfuscated malicious commands with various different languages and ciphers, as well as scenario constructs. So I think, it's a whole thing to unpack, but the bottom line here is, when you don't have cognitive diversity within a red team, you're overlooking a lot of what's available when it comes to attacks. And if I could just add one more note here, I think, we saw these statistics earlier. Cultivating gender diversity could actually be a direct way to cultivate cognitive diversity, right? Like most of these red teams are composed entirely of men. And they're men with backgrounds in STEM. And we know that it is systematically more difficult for women to get into STEM than it is for men. So if we start, at the very simple level of accessibility into fields that require a certain kind of expertise, we might actually kind of put ourselves on this trajectory where we can open up opportunities to teams that are truly cognitively diverse and diverse in terms of gender and ideology and whatever else.
Thank you, Sasha. This was very insightful. Well, Clara, I'm very tempted to ask you very particular questions that is capitalizing on the earlier discussions during the keynote and the first panel regarding the fact that we need to add more female instinct and motherly instinct to the AI. So from your education perspective, I'd like to ask that we know that children are often the most impacted, yet least protected in the system. So what specific gaps regarding your experience in the educational sector exist in current human rights frameworks regarding under regulated algorithmic influence on a child's cognitive development?
Yes, thank you for this question. And this might be a good opportunity for us to reflect on who isn't here today, the ones that are the most vulnerable and the most impacted, our children. They are not here, and they are not part of these conversations. This is a world that is happening to them. And I want to start by going back to a famous study in social psychology that was done in the United States in the late 50s and was submitted to the Supreme Court in early 60s, I believe, as supporting evidence for the idea that American schools should be desegregated. It is a study, I think everybody refers to it as the doll experiment, but it's a study where a series of girls were given dolls to play with, and then the psychologists were simply observing what dolls the children picked. And the white girls in the experiment picked, they were black and white dolls, and the white girls picked the white dolls. And when they were asked why they picked these dolls, they said, well, they look nice and they look like me and I like them. When the black girls were picking dolls, they also picked the white dolls. And when they were asked why they picked the white dolls, they said, well, the black dolls are ugly and I don't want to look like this. And if we then jump forward into the world of AI, when Google search entered the classrooms 20 years ago, many of you have grown up with this technology in your classroom, these same deep infrastructure biases and preferences about how we are to think about ourselves or internalize truths about ourselves have been very evident in the system, and they are even today. If I go and make a simple Google search, something like beautiful body, and hit enter, what I will get is a bunch of images of women, although I didn't do a gendered search, that are muscular, lean, athletic, very thin, and in bikinis. Because somehow that's what the algorithm believes that the world of a beautiful body looks like. And up until recently, if I put in something like beautiful girl, every girl that I would see in my image search would be a girl that had blonde hair, blue eyes, and very Scandinavian-looking features. Now Google has done some actual efforts to try and make it more inclusive. So now when you do a beautiful girl search, you get girls of many different skin colors and hair textures. But if you look closely at their faces, what you'll see is that the algorithm has still pricked out faces of beautiful that fits the same profile. They have the same noses, the same eyes, and so on. Add now to that our children are growing up in a deeply driven algorithmic world where social media, the educational technology that they use, and the people that are around them are pushing particular narratives that are fracturing the truth, if there is such a thing still, and that these children are continuously affected by this. And this all put together develops a child that begins to believe what they experience in the algorithmic world. Parents might say this isn't true. Teachers might try to present different ideas, but the drive of the AI-driven technology in that child's world is incredibly strong. So what we're really looking at is, can we use AI-driven technology in front of a child, with a child, and have children grow up in a world where they are still living to understand a semblance of truth, a semblance of order, that they understand when algorithmic decisions are being made for them, and when they understand what they are capable of doing. Because if we want to include women in technology, and we do, it must surely start with the belief that women themselves understand that this is something that they could actually do, not something that is impossible for them to reach.
Thank you very much, Clara. As the time of our panel is approaching to an end, it's going to be the last round of questions for our dearest panelists. So I'll start with Ulrike. So how can intellectual property policy be used as a specific tool to encourage more women to lead in the frontier technology space?
I mean, I could give you a plain vanilla answer, and that answer is certainly correct. I mean, I could say mentoring, I could say simplifying procedure, I could say trainings out there, and all of that is correct. But as I was thinking about an answer to that question, I was thinking back to when I started my current job. And I'm actually very privileged in that I've been in my role since 2019, 3.5 years before ChatGPT came along. I'm also very privileged that I had a small team when we started this off, and we were all ladies, 3 ladies from 3 different parts of the world. We did something called the WIPO conversation. So we get people together twice a year. We've reached more than 20,000 people. We've had, I think, more than 400 or 500 speakers in the WIPO conversations. With all of the best intentions in the UN system behind the world, we designed these conversations to be as inclusive and as diverse as we possibly could. Each conversation had about 50 speakers on them. We sent out invites to more than 50% women. We have yet to reach 50% of women in there. So what I see is, despite all of the best of trying, there is a massive participation gap. So I don't know what the answer to that is, even if you start off at the best possible position when you have women driving for that. My reply to it is, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. So it's just something that will continue all of us to keep pushing.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. And for Bridget, I know that AI is already automating entry-level tasks. So what policy interventions do we need to protect the career pipeline for young women who are just entering the workforce?
Yeah, this is a topic that I'm personally very interested in and also quite concerned about. I think, at the start of this forum, Dr. Cadariu sort of presented the findings from McKinsey about, the impact on entry-level women. They are already facing an opportunity gap, an ambition gap, and actually in that same study as well, they found that only 21% of entry-level women are encouraged by their managers to use AI versus about 33% of their male counterparts. And I think if you sort of think, in combination with the fact that we expect AI to be able to get much better at doing entry-level tasks, what does it mean if we really think about it to the end of the future pipeline of women leaders? This is ultimately a panel of women in leadership position. And so that's something that I'm quite concerned with. And part of the response, I think, has to be a certain level of commitment by leaders in organizations to really want to groom and nurture their existing talent, both male and female, but I think in particular for female talent, just because of the existing challenges that they are facing. And I personally, in my own experience, have benefited from a lot of mentors throughout my career. And I think mentorship, is one example that I think we really need to be more deliberate about. I think mentorship, we need to sort of perhaps focus on, 2 areas. One, it's, showcasing how women have walked their path and, allowing these women to sort of see what their future could look like. But the other area, I think, of mentorship as well, that maybe we sort of need to encourage more is how we can sort of share how these women can also think about certain issues and sort of sharing the different mental models that we have to solve problems, right? In the world of AI, we've heard from the first panel, there's this cognitive offloading. And so I think we really need to sort of encourage that critical thinking, problem-solving skill. And different organizations think about problems differently. The mental models are very different, and sort of need to really encourage that. These mental models can be insufficient, incomplete, but you sort of need to engage on what these existing mental models are before you can change it.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Now I address my question to Clara regarding the educational role that you have. So how do we shift the focus of AI literacy from being a user skill to governance capability that empowers women to be architects of the rules?
Yes, thank you. So I'll start it in a greater scheme of things and with the human rights framework, because we heard earlier that the world order is shifting, that the way we create the global narratives, the way we have diplomacy, the way we solve crisis is shifting. But the human rights framework is still there. We haven't gotten rid of it yet. And so we've talked about women's issues, but we really need to ground ourselves in human rights issues, because when women are harmed or algorithmically taken out of society or out of consideration, the whole world is harmed, including that of males. So I think a starting point is for us to think about how committed we are to these principles. And then when we work on national curriculum for education, when we work on tertiary curriculum planning in higher education, how these technologies align with our mission, our vision, our values. We've asked and heard a lot about how we need to urgently use AI, but I believe we more urgently need to ask, who are we? What is it that we want to be for Morocco? What kind of moral fabric do we want to weave into our young ones? What is the next generation of citizens that we want for our community? And then decide how AI can support this. That said, I have put forth the argument that the human rights articles are not sufficient when AI is infrastructure. I do believe that we possibly need a 31st article that addresses things like the right to cognitive autonomy, the right not to have AI decision-making or AI-driven decision-making, and the right to grow up developing the agency that's so urgently needed for our children. And that is the work of institutions like the United Nations, but it's also the work of individual schools, large or small, where educators and school leaders need to sit down with parents and children and understand what it is that we're trying to build and how we do that successfully.
Thank you very much, Clara. I would address the same question for both Maha and Sasha, and we will consider it as the wrapping up question, the final question. So I'd like to Maha to give me a perspective from a technical point of view, and Sasha from more a risk and safety framework point of view. So if you had to name a concrete policy, standard, or institutional mechanism that we must prioritize today to ensure AI governance is both globally aligned and locally trusted, what would it be from a technical perspective and from risk and safety perspective?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question. I think one of the things that comes to mind for me right away, which was talked about in our previous panel, as well as AI literacy. And specific targeted interventions that actually focalize on young people, right? Because the idea here is to create the conditions for a world that future generations will actually be proud to inherit. And we can't just leave them enfeebled in that respect. But I also think that the AI literacy focus in this particular instance should actually be tailored toward how to think in an AI world. And to me, that requires an understanding of how to think on nonlinear timescales, as well as extremely large physical scales, right? Because you need to be able to understand impacts, and you also need to be able to understand how things evolve over time. And the tricky thing there is that as people, we have not evolved to think in those ways. We prioritize community, we prioritize similarity, we prioritize things that are local. And that makes sense. But in order to navigate the future that we're walking into and this quote unquote new world order, we need to be able to adapt our thinking alongside the technology in a way that's meaningful. And then there's one more thing I want to add here that I think is not directly related to this, but I'd be curious from the audience who has interacted with an advanced AI model, who has ever received a response along the lines of, I don't know? Raise your hand. None. So when it comes to risk, uncertainty is the dominating factor. And we need to be able to meaningfully navigate uncertainty. And humans have this wonderful, wonderful thing we call intuition, which helps us perhaps in more ways than we'd like to admit. AIs don't have that. They also lack common sense. And so from a design standpoint, I think one of the most important properties that we could possibly bake into these systems is epistemic humility. Knowing when to say, I don't know, knowing when to request involvement. Because otherwise, we're just dealing with systems that consistently operate with a false sense of certainty about their own internal processes, but also the processes that they're following in the real world.
Thank you very much. So the final word would be to you, Maha, since you represent both the academic world, but also the tech builder and technical people. What would be your final recommendation?
Okay, thank you. And Hurt, of course, to close this amazing panel. But I would like adding, of course, on all what have been said so far, that my experience, as you well said, dear Salma, from the academy, as well as from the ecosystem, is that we sometimes, to be really honest, it has been now years I'm working in AI, but still sometimes I feel, and that's very personal, that AI is becoming, especially LLMs and now agentic AI, is becoming a monster out of control. And I think that in the future, we won't go with the super powerful tools that we are now so amazed by, but rather go into SLMs, for example, instead of LLMs, small language models, instead of large language models, something very adaptive and adapted to the context. Even big companies today are going through very hard time with Gemini, Copilot, and so forth, and they're choosing now to use their own, to build by their team, their own SLMs, something very, first, not consuming too much energy, but this is a point that we didn't discuss, but I think this is very important, especially for our continent and our country. But also something adapted to the culture. Like, for example, I've been working in GCC and I have noticed that LLMs are very bad in Arabic and in some dialects as well. So that's why it proves us again that international regulations are very important. To comply to standards, international standards is very important. However, we have to customize it to our small ecosystem, starting from a school, a college, university, institution, a government, etc. So that would be customizing, continuous monitoring, and wisdom and integrity. That will be the final words.
Thank you very much, Maha. Thank you, dear panelists, for this incredible exchange. We've covered a lot of ground today, but if you take only 3 things away, let it be these. Trust is not negotiable. Governance creates the safety required for society. Say yes to AI. Diversity is a requirement, not an add-on. It is our most effective tool ensuring safety. Systems without diverse perspectives are simply systems with built-in failures. Women at the center. Inclusion isn't a favor, it is a condition for success. When women shape the rules, the resulting AI serves society better. Finally, governance is the bridge between innovation and impact, but that bridge only holds if it's built on trust and diversity. Thank you very much, and I might give the floor to Madame Rita Mzour, who has something to say and questions to ask.
My name is Rita Mzour. I'm the former Minister of Digital Transformation of Morocco and today a CEO of an AI company. So I'm fully aware of the biases. I'll just give you one concrete example. So I, like everybody here today, I use AI for my work. And one day, just for fun, I asked it to draw a picture of me. So it drew a picture of a Western man. And I said, why a man? And the AI responded, you're in a leadership position, so men are more likely to be in leadership position. That's why I do a picture of a man. And then I say, why Western? And AI responded, you work on AI. Typically, Westerners are more advanced on AI. So here, as a woman in Morocco, we suffer from a double bias. The bias of gender, but also, as you mentioned, the bias of our cultures not being represented. So only 2% of data that was used to train AI is from Africa. The whole Africa only holds for 2% of what. So the biases are there. And I'm not against regulation, but don't you think, a lot of everybody thinking about regulation policies, but don't you think that a strong AI regulation can actually be very dangerous? And I mean my word. Why? You mentioned earlier the risk of fragmented regulation. But what about strong regulation? Because the big tech can afford an army of lawyers. They can afford to wait months to get approval because they have other projects. Whereas a startup and SME, this can be deadly for them if they have to go for all this regulation before this approval before they even get to the market. It's also a risk for our countries because other countries have developed their AI without thinking about the extra charge of regulation. But when we start developing it nowadays, now all of a sudden everybody is talking about risk and we have to regulate. Yes, regulation is there, but it has to be done very carefully, especially for our country, for us. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
I'll jump in on this for a second. So to your point, there's actually a concept for this. It was coined by a professor of sociology at Harvard. Her name is Shoshana Zuboff, and she refers to it as digital dispossession. So it's essentially this process that big tech players go through where they will actively violate laws, and because they have the capital to just swim by those violations, pay the fines, and then do it all over again and claim some sort of ignorance or negligence, they keep doing it. Google and Amazon have a very long track record of doing this, as does Meta and now OpenAI. Now, in terms of a real world case study, this was actually some research that I did back for my dissertation. What we saw when the GDPR was implemented in Europe was that major tech companies actually increased their market cap by a substantial margin. And the reasoning was very simple. Smaller competitors could not afford compliance with the GDPR because it was a very rigorous framework. And so they were either bought up by major tech or just had to close down because they didn't have the legal teams and the resources and the finances to actually comply with a really complex and robust regulation. And you could extend this particular case study to the EU AI Act, right? So I assume that most people in this room are aware of the Omnibus revision proposal. That proposal essentially takes a major step back on a regulation that had some pretty strong teeth in it. Now it's pulling back, or essentially pulling out a lot of those teeth and weakening it in the interest of facilitating innovation within the EU. So I think you make a very astute point. And frankly, I don't have a solution for it. I think that one direction we could go in, coming from the US, it doesn't seem like regulation is really optimistic for us, especially under our current administration. But setting that aside, I almost feel as though a more effective way to move forward with this and avoid or perhaps mitigate some of these risks that you're alluding to is by developing very specific tools that are aimed at managing and understanding the impacts of this technology on society and making those tools transferable to different cultures and societies. I think it's easier to make a tool interoperable than it is to make a conceptual framework interoperable, especially if it's based on values or principles. So yeah, I'll leave you with that.
I'm sorry, may I add something very quickly? Thank you. Bonjour, Madame la Ministre. Thank you for this amazing question. May I just add a point? It must be just a way of thinking, but I think one key element might be thinking regionally, as Sasha said before, like if you think about the AU-AI Act or the GDPR in Europe, etc., it is very hard for the continent today to get into these laws, to comply to these laws. However, if we think about something that might not let us struggle in with the regulations, should be regional. For example, African or North African or abroad African or with Middle East. So I think this can be one of the solutions that we must. But I totally agree. Regulation should be, and this is something, also I want to add something before to end up, is that this is like personal. Because in many countries, what I have noticed is that there was a very low regulation and they end up with very high innovation. At the same time, other countries and other regions have done the opposite and they have been also having a very nice innovation. So I think there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but maybe if we want to reflect on it more, the solution might be regional.
If I may, seeing that I started it all.
We need the second panel.
So, I mean, I confess that before joining the AI world, I was a lawyer in private practice, and I spent many years working in the pharma industry. So while I don't know about big tech, I certainly know about market power and regulation playing into different hands. I mean, what I'd probably say is that there's nothing that comes for free. There's a price to be paid. One of them is certainly lack of regulation, and very often we have systems that start with lack of regulation, drive innovation. The impact of that and the price to be paid very often is society. And I give the example of the pharmaceutical industry. Very often something will be developed, an innovation, and then there's an impact in a drug that goes wrong, and then massive regulation comes in to minimize the impact of society. So I think for me it is a question where you want to put the balance, and this is why also I think fragmentation is going to be inevitable. Different countries, different regions are finding their own path forward, because there is no right or wrong answer to you must have regulation, you must not have regulation. It's a question where you put the balance on the burden of society between driving innovation, between protecting creators, between protecting society. So I think it's a balance between all of them.
Thank you, Clara.
Yes, I'll be quick, I promise. What I think about is startups, and I can imagine a startup, perhaps a startup here in Morocco that want to manufacture applesauce for babies. With these wonderful Moroccan apples. They do a little bit of testing before they go to market. And in their testing, they kind of realize that out of 10,000 babies that will eat this applesauce, maybe 10 will die. And about 50% of the babies that grow up eating this applesauce will develop mental health issues. Would we allow a product like that to go to market? We wouldn't. We have enormous oversight on the food products, and Morocco is exceptionally good at this type of oversight. We have oversight on many other things that affect our children and our day-to-day life. But for some reason, we encourage this idea that we must innovate, we must go to market, and then things maybe will break, but we will fix it later on. Social media is a fantastic example of that. We know it's a defective product. We know that children are losing their lives or being significantly hurt. We've seen court cases recently that support that statement, and yet it's still in our children's lives every day. Educational technology, another area where we've rushed in to innovate. In the last 2-3 years, we've seen edtech companies drive generative artificial decision-making into their system for grading, for giving feedback to students, some for emotional monitoring and feedback loops. But there's very little regulation, and we're using our children as beta testers. We simply cannot allow for our community of children that are growing up today, growing up without meaningful regulation, at minimum one that addresses the risk we're exposing them to when they are using this technology. And then I'll finish by saying, when we say innovation, it sounds like something rushed to market with an idea. I think innovation is being able to come up with a phenomenal idea inside of a regulated environment. And if you wonder about whether you can innovate in a very regulated environment, just turn to the children in schools, because they are very regulated, and I promise you, they are very, very innovative.
Thank you. On those wise words, we wrap up our panel. Madame la Ministre, thank you very much for your addition, for the questions. We can keep up the discussion since it is very interesting, but in terms of timekeeping, we will wrap up our session, and I would like to thank again our panelists under your applause. And I think it is time for the group photo.
Thank you, Ms. Salma.